Now, this is where the really interesting part begins. Imagine we had solved the problems that we just recently talked about, like, for example, getting the right people together, coming up with some kind of basic business and strategy model, building the first homes where people can stay for a longer period of time if they commit themselves to the project or if they commit themselves to the community. Uh, by being involved in the business model, you could basically maintain the whole thing. You could pay for the whole thing, and thus guarantee a very low threshold entry point for those who want to join. It would be, in other words, very cheap for them. They wouldn't have to pay with money, but they could pay with commitment. Commitment also to the integral goal or integral vision. So you would open it up for people from various backgrounds, and wouldn't focus only on those who can pay for it to be part of the whole thing. So imagine we have covered this basic level of creating a sense of belonging and a sense of being together and covering the basic need for a shelter. Now the really interesting part begins, and here I think we can make things a bit different than they usually are being done in our academic environments. And again, I'm taking the academic environment because I think this is the closest to where orientational knowledge has been institutionalized or being actually brought forth systematically in the past. And we could do a few things differently than have been done in the academic environment. The first thing is, I think we need much more dense encounters. We need much more high density encounters, if you want. Think about a typical lecture environment. A typical lecture at university takes somewhat around 20 hours of time to really give the professor the time to express a point of view on a specific subject. This format, of course, goes far beyond anything that you can find in on news media, for example, where information is broken down into such a low resolution that you have to fit the 5-minute segment general guideline. You have to get an idea across in five minutes, which of course is impossible. And the intellectual dark web people have rightly been criticizing this media format as basically making it impossible to communicate any kind of relevant, meaningful, and complex idea through this very, very narrow channel that the media are offering in general. Now, universities have a much higher resolution on issues. Here people can get together and discuss issues in much more detail, and yet it's still not a high-density form of exchange that would really suffice to really get anywhere as well. It's simply not enough to spend an entire lecture where two professors, for example, are exchanging ideas for them to really get anywhere. This is not enough. I think we need to go even more extreme than that. I think we really need to be able to lock up people for at least 2 weeks, I guess, a blind shot. We would have to make them engage with each other through this period of time if they want to get anywhere, and if there is really true disagreement between their positions, and if they're having really different backgrounds and paradigms from which they're coming from. This is something that you can't witness anywhere. Whenever a conference, for example, really starts to get interesting, and people have just scratched the surface and start to dig more deep and start to get anywhere, you hear the signal that it's time for lunch. The lunch break is there, and you can't really get anywhere. Or the moment it gets really interesting, the conference is already over, and people have so important things to do. They have something else to do. I don't know what exactly, which is so much more important than discussing these issues, where it gets really, really hot in the room, and where it really gets interesting. Suddenly, everyone has to do something that is so much more important. I don't know what it exactly is, but for some reason, everyone then this exact moment has to leave the room. And I don't think this is a general strategy, or I don't think this is a general format where you can get anywhere. The result of this, of course, is that you basically end up with islands that have different opinions and that can't really get across their ideas and can't really understand each other. So the first thing I would start with is simply creating an environment that is high density enough for people to really engage with each other. And I'm not talking about random people, but I'm talking about people who have really devoted themselves to doing integralism or to doing cosmology, to use another kind of word. People who have devoted themselves to study the entirety of human knowledge and check it for its really valuable contributions. And these people need to be locked up in rooms for a few weeks at least, in high-density discussions and go through high-density details, high-density sources, and discuss these in details. This is something you can't find anywhere. You can't find. This is something that which never actually happens. It never happens that you lock up someone like Chomsky, for example, with someone like Sam Harris for 2 weeks and really force them to communicate on ideas that are truly important. Now, this is, of course, now. This is not to be taken literally. Of course, it wouldn't make sense to force Chomsky and Sam Harris into a room for 2 weeks because they wouldn't want to do that. But I'm talking about people who would be willing to engage themselves in this kind of format because they think this is the way to go forward, and this is the way to really bridge different paradigms. And there is no other systematic way of bridging paradigms. Even Integral can't solve these cross-paradigmatic problems that we face. We need the actual people to make these steps themselves. You can't have a meta system that dissolves all the problems and different conflicts that arise between paradigms on a specific level. Integral itself is not specific enough to solve even one problem that exists on the specific levels of engaging with objects. The only way I see this working is when these people themselves make these steps. This is these people who come from these specialized fields or who come from these paradigms. If they themselves engage with each other and start to see that the other person is not just plain stupid, but they might have good reasons for believing what they believe, and once they start grasping what their reasons are, they maybe then might be more capable of widening their own perspective so that it can alter the other perspective. And that's what I think, saw happening in small degrees in the Zizek-Peterson debate, which I already used as an example. This is something that doesn't really happen that often, that you have people with such opposing views who sit together for such a long period of time and try to get into details. But this was just a basic starting point. It's by far not enough. You would really have to lock up these two guys for a few weeks and really force them to go through certain evidence, force them to go through certain primary literature. And you would maybe have to go even further and expect them to come prepared, give them a specific reading list that they have to go through, literature that they have to study, and then come to a discussion. I think this is the way to go if you really want to bridge worldviews. And I don't see an alternative to that, and I don't see institutions do that. For whatever reason, it has not been established, but for whatever reason, we have so much more important things to do than really getting together and really getting our worldviews across.